My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 31 years old and I underwrite mortgages for a living. I spend my days deciding whether strangers deserve the roof over their heads, reading income statements the way other people read weather reports, looking for the crack that tells you a house is about to come apart. I never once thought I'd have to run that same math on my own marriage. 8 months pregnant, I stood on my mother-in-law's porch in Ridgefield, Ohio, in October, holding a laundry basket of my own clothes because that's what fit in my arms in the 90 seconds she gave me. Linda Bennett stood in the doorway in her bathrobe at 9:40 at night, pointing down the steps like she was directing traffic, and she screamed the sentence loud enough that the neighbor's porch light came on across the street. "Get out of my son's house?" I want you to sit with that sentence for a second because it's the whole story folded into 6 words, and Linda had no idea how wrong it was. I didn't correct her. I didn't say a word. I got in my car with my basket of clothes and my hospital bag already packed in the trunk for a due date 3 weeks out. And I drove to the Red Roof Inn off Route 60 and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make my hands work well enough to check in. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at that house. Not from me, from my bank. And when Linda Bennett opened it standing at her own kitchen counter, she found something in it that made her call me screaming for the second time that week. Except this time, she wasn't screaming at me to leave. She was screaming at me to come back. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally tell you what was in the folder nobody thought to check. If you've ever been thrown out of a house you were actually holding up, this one's for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly what was sitting in a filing cabinet in Ridgefield, Ohio, 3 years before that October night, and why Linda Bennett never once. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what that house actually was. I met Daniel Bennett when I was 26, working the underwriting desk at First Heritage Bank in Marietta, and he was the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and never once made me feel like my job was cold or strange. He liked that I read fine print for a living. He said it made him feel safe, like I'd never let him sign something that could hurt him. I didn't know yet that the person I'd eventually be reading fine print to protect from was going to be his own mother. Linda Bennett was a widow by the time I met her, 61 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house on Cardinal Court that her husband Gene had built with his own crew back in the 80s. And that house, I want you to understand, was never as solid as it looked from the street. Gene Bennett died of a heart attack in the garage on a Tuesday in March, wrench still in his hand, 4 years before I ever set foot in that house. He'd run his own HVAC business for 30 years, cash heavy, the kind of operation where half the ledger lived in his head and the other half lived in a shoebox. When he died, Linda inherited a house with no mortgage on paper but a business with more debt than anyone in the family knew existed. Because Gene had quietly refinanced the house twice in his last 5 years to keep the company afloat, and he'd never told her the second time. I know this because eventually it became my job to know it. Linda found out the truth about her own finances the way a lot of widows do, slowly and always from a stranger. A collections call here. A letter from a lender she didn't recognize there. By the time Daniel and I started dating, Linda was 3 years into a private balloon payment refinance that Gene had signed alone, one of those loans that starts reasonable and then detonates on a set date, and the date it detonated was 11 months into my relationship with her son. I want to be fair to Linda here, because this story doesn't work if you think she's a cartoon. She raised 2 kids on her own after Gene died, kept the porch light on every night like it might bring him back, and she loved Daniel with the specific, suffocating intensity of a woman who'd already lost the other man in her life and wasn't going to lose this one too. She was warm to her church friends, generous with casseroles, the kind of woman neighbors described as a saint. She just had one rule that ran underneath everything else in that house, spoken and unspoken both. What's mine stays mine, and what's Daniel's is mine too, because I made him. I learned that rule the first Thanksgiving I spent at Cardinal Court. Daniel and I had been together 8 months. I'd brought a pie I'd made myself, and Linda took one polite bite, set down her fork, and said, "Well, you tried," in a tone so pleasant it took me a full minute to realize I'd been insulted. Daniel didn't notice. That's the thing about growing up in a house like that, you stop hearing the frequency after a while. I heard it immediately because I'd spent my whole career trained to listen for the sentence underneath the sentence. Underwriting teaches you that people rarely lie outright, they just leave things off the application. Daniel proposed 2 years later in the backyard of Cardinal Court, because Linda insisted. Because Linda insisted on everything involving her son's milestones happening on her lawn, under her maple tree, close enough that she could watch from the kitchen window. I said yes, I meant it. I want that on the record because everything that came after gets easier to misread if you forget that I loved him, and for a long time I tried very hard to love her too. The balloon payment came due the spring before our wedding. Daniel came to me on a Sunday night, quiet in a way I'd never seen him, and told me his mother had gotten a letter. 90 days to pay off the remaining balance on Jean's private refinance or the house would go to foreclosure. $58,000, give or take, on a woman living on a fixed income from Jean's small life insurance policy and a part-time job at the church office that paid barely enough to cover her own groceries. I didn't say anything that night. I went into my office at the bank the next morning and pulled Linda's file the way I'd pull any file, professionally, dispassionately, because that's the only way I know how to look at a problem clearly. And what I found sitting in that 90-day window was exactly what I expected. A house worth roughly $210,000, appraised conservatively, sitting on top of a $58,000 time bomb that had dead. There was one way to save that house, and it wasn't a loan Linda could get on her own. At 65, part-time income, no real credit history beyond Jean's old accounts. No bank in Ohio was touching that application, and I would know because I was the person who'd have to reject it. The clean way, the only sane way, was for someone with actual income and actual credit to refinance the loan themselves in their own name and become the one holding the paper. I sat at my kitchen table with Daniel that night, and I told him what I did for a living meant something now, that I could fix this the right way, the documented way, if he trusted me to do it properly. He cried. He said his mother would never have to know how close she came. He said I was saving his family. I want you to remember that sentence because 8 months pregnant, standing on that same porch with a laundry basket in my arms, I was going to hear a very different one. I refinanced Jean Bennett's balloon loan in my own name 3 weeks before our wedding. Sarah Bennett, soon to be, on the paperwork already prepared that way at Daniel's request, because he said it would feel more like a family thing if it already had my married name on it. Sole borrower, sole obligor, first lien holder recorded at the Washington County Courthouse. Linda signed a quitclaim deed the same week, transferring title into my name as part of the refinance package, because that's how the math worked. You can't refinance a house you don't legally hold. She signed it in Daniel's lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in her good church cardigan, dabbing her eyes and thanking God for her son. She never once asked to see the paperwork. She never once asked whose name was actually on the deed. She signed where her son's lawyer told her to sign, and she went home and told her prayer group that the Lord had provided. I paid that mortgage every month for the next 3 years out of my own account, on top of rent for the apartment Daniel and I shared 4 miles away. Because Linda insisted that moving into Jean's house felt wrong to her, disrespectful, and so instead I paid to keep a roof over a woman who didn't know I was the one holding it up, while living somewhere else entirely. I told myself that was generosity. It took me a long time to understand it was something closer to invisibility, and my father died when I was 24, 2 years before I met Daniel. And I mention him now because everything I did in that house on Cardinal Court traces back to something he taught me standing in his own garage, not so different from the one Jean Bennett died in. Walter Reyes was a title examiner for 31 years at a small abstract company in Zanesville, the kind of job nobody understands at a dinner party. He spent his life reading county records, chains of title, easements nobody remembered granting, liens people swore didn't exist until he pulled the book and proved they did. He used to say that most family arguments were really property disputes wearing a costume, and that the truth was almost always sitting in a courthouse basement, indifferent to what anybody felt about it. The week before my father died, a stroke, sudden, no warning, 40 minutes between the phone call and the ambulance, I sat with him at his kitchen table while he showed me, unprompted, like he knew something the rest of us didn't, how to read a deed. Grantor, grantee, legal description, recording stamp. He tapped the paper with one finger and said the sentence I would end up building my entire adult life around, though I didn't know it yet. People forget, paper remembers what people forget, Sarah. That's the whole job. You just have to be the one willing to look. I didn't think about that sentence again for 2 years. Then I sat across from Daniel at our kitchen table with Linda's foreclosure letter between us, and it walked right back into the room like it had been waiting. I want to explain something about the year that followed because it matters for what happens later. I didn't refinance that house to trap anyone. I didn't sit there scheming about leverage or control. I did it because I loved Daniel, because I was 28 and newly married and genuinely believed that saving his mother's home was the kind of thing a good wife did quietly, without asking for credit. The way my own mother had quietly kept our family's books straight for 30 years without my father ever once having to think about it. But I am, by training and by temperament, a person who documents things. It is not optional for me. It is not a personality quirk I can set down when it's inconvenient. When I signed that refinance, I photographed every page front and back the same night, the way I'd been taught, and saved them in a folder on a hard drive that lived in a fireproof box in the closet of the apartment Linda never visited. I kept every mortgage statement. I kept the recorded deed. I kept, because I am my father's daughter whether I like it or not, a complete and boring paper trail of exactly who owned exactly what. Linda never asked to see any of it. And here is the detail that took me 3 years to understand the weight of. Daniel never asked either. For a while, that felt like trust. Both of them, uninterested in the mechanics, content to let me carry the invisible plumbing of the family's financial life the way I carried it every day at the bank for strangers. I told myself this was what love looked like in a family that ran on feelings instead of facts. You find the person who's good at facts, and you let her handle it, and you thank her with warmth instead of paperwork. It took me longer than it should have to notice that Linda's warmth toward me had a schedule. It arrived on holidays and church functions in front of an audience dressed up and photographed. It evaporated completely the moment we were alone in her kitchen, replaced by something colder and more assessing. The same look I realized eventually that I gave a loan file when the numbers didn't add up the way the applicant wanted them to. Linda was auditing me. She just didn't know that I'd already passed the only audit that mattered 3 years earlier in a lawyer. For the first 2 years after the refinance, the house on Cardinal Court ran on a kind of peace I mistook for permanence. Linda kept living there rent-free, mortgage handled, utilities on auto pay from an account I managed without ever mentioning it. She redid the kitchen backsplash with money she said she'd found, which I understood later meant she'd started skimming a little off the household budget I sent her every month for taxes and maintenance. The same way Ruth had skimmed her own pension in another story I'd tell you if this weren't already Linda's. I let it go, $50 here, $70 there. It felt small enough to not be worth the fight, and I had learned early in my marriage that fighting Linda over small things cost more than the small things were worth. Daniel and I bought our own place that second spring, a modest 3-bedroom 15 minutes from Cardinal Court, my name and his both on that deed, which felt at the time like the most ordinary thing in the world, 2 incomes, 1 mortgage, 1 house, the way it's supposed to work. I remember standing in the empty living room the day we got the keys, running my hand along a wall that had never belonged to anyone else, and feeling something settle in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. It would take Linda's porch 2 years later to teach me the word was safety, and that I'd never once felt it on Cardinal Court, not even holding the deed. Linda liked our new house well enough, in the way she liked most things that weren't hers, politely, at a distance, with faint commentary. She told her church friends her son had done so well for himself, which was a sentence that erased me as thoroughly as the porch scream eventually would, just quieter. I noticed it and let it go. I was good by then at letting things go. It's a skill you build the same way you build calluses, repetition, and the story you tell yourself about why it doesn't hurt anymore. Here's what I want you to understand about that middle stretch because it's the part people skip when they tell stories like this. It wasn't bad, that's the trap of it. Sunday dinners at Cardinal Court were, on the surface, warm. Linda taught me her stuffing recipe badly, correcting my every move with a patience that looked like generosity if you didn't know to read it as control. She hugged me at Christmas. She cried a little at our first anniversary dinner, and said she was so glad Daniel had found someone steady. I wrote that sentence down in my head the way I write down everything, filed it under evidence that things were fine, that the foundation under this family was solid even if I was the only one who knew where the load-bearing wall actually was. I got pregnant that January, and for about 4 months, Linda Bennett became a different woman entirely, or at least a version of herself I hadn't met yet. She called twice a week to ask how I was feeling. She sent a box of hand-me-down baby clothes that had been Daniel's, yellowed at the collars, and included a note in her looping handwriting that said, "For the next Bennett." She started referring to the baby, unprompted, as my grandson, with a confidence about the sex that no ultrasound had confirmed, and I let that go too, because pregnancy makes you generous with strangers' certainty in a way I didn't fully understand until it happened to me. I want to be honest about something here because this channel is about telling the truth quietly, and the truth is that I wanted this to work so badly that I started editing my own observations in real time. Little things would happen, Linda referring to Daniel's house when she meant Cardinal Court, Linda telling a neighbor that she'd held onto that place for her son, Linda once, at 6 months pregnant, patting my stomach and saying, "This baby's going to grow up knowing exactly whose family he belongs to," and I would file each one under harmless, under old-fashioned, under she doesn't mean it the way it sounds. I had spent 3 years building a mortgage file no one asked to see. I had gotten very good at building files nobody read, including, apparently, files about my own life. There was a Tuesday in August, 7 months pregnant, when I drove out to Cardinal Court to drop off a check for the property tax installment. I still handled it directly by then, out of habit more than necessity, and I found Linda in the kitchen with a real estate agent's business card sitting on the counter, face up, like she hadn't bothered to hide it. When I asked about it lightly, the way you ask about something you're hoping has an innocent answer, she said, without missing a beat, that she'd just been curious what the market was doing. That I believed her. I want that on the record the way I've wanted everything else on the record in this story. I believed her because believing her was easier than doing what I actually know how to do for a living, which is pull the file and check. I didn't pull the file, not yet. I was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and telling myself that the woman who cried at my anniversary dinner and mailed me her son's baby clothes was not the same woman who kept a realtor's card sitting out like a loaded gun on her kitchen counter. I found out 3 weeks later, on the worst night of that whole year, exactly how wrong I'd been about which version of Linda Bennett was real. October 14th. I remember the date the way I remember every date that matters, because I chart things, because that's the whole shape of who I am, and because that night is the one I will still be able to recite in 20 years without checking a single note. I was 8 months pregnant, 36 weeks, big enough that I'd started sleeping propped up on 3 pillows and walking like a woman carrying a bowling ball strapped to her front. Daniel was out of town, a work training in Columbus, back the next afternoon. I hadn't planned to go to Cardinal Court that night at all. Linda called me at 7:15, voice bright and urgent in the specific way that always meant she needed something, and asked if I could come by and help her sort through some paperwork for her taxes. She said it like a small thing. She said it like a woman who'd already decided how the evening was going to go and needed me standing in the right room when it happened. I should tell you, because it matters, that I almost said no. I was tired in the bone-deep way only late pregnancy teaches you, and Daniel wasn't around to buffer whatever mood Linda might be in. But she said please in a voice I hadn't heard from her in months, soft and a little scared sounding. And 28 years of being the person who shows up got me in the car before I'd finished thinking it through. The house was dark except for the kitchen when I pulled into the driveway, and Linda was already standing at the door before I'd made it up the porch steps, arms crossed over her bathrobe, and I understood in the half-second before she spoke that this was not going to be about taxes. I talked to a lawyer, she said, no hello, no how are you feeling, about the house. I stood on the bottom step, one hand on the rail because balance had gotten complicated by then, and I asked her carefully, what lawyer, what about the house? He says it's not right, Linda said. A house Gene built with his own hands sitting in your name instead of Daniel's. He says a wife shouldn't be holding property that belongs to a son. He says I should never have signed that quitclaim, that Daniel's lawyer took advantage of a grieving widow, and I want it fixed. I felt the baby shift, hard under my ribs the way she did when I got tense, and I stood very still and told Linda the truth as plainly as I could manage. That I had refinanced her defaulting loan with my own credit because no other lender would touch her application. That the deed transfer had been part of that refinance, not separate from it, not optional, not something anyone had tricked her into, that her own son's lawyer had explained every page to her before she signed, and that I had the paperwork, every page of it, if she wanted to actually look this time instead of asking a lawyer to imagine a version of events that never happened. I want you to understand that I said all of this gently. I was not trying to win an argument. I was 8 months pregnant on her porch steps at 9:30 at night, and some tired, hopeful part of me still believed that if I just laid the facts down calmly enough, she would recognize them, the way people usually do when you show them their own signature on their own page. Linda's face did something I had never seen it do before. It went very still and then it went hard, the softness draining out of it. "You've had a plan this whole time," she said. "You married into this family and you took his father's house right out from under him and you let us all thank you for it." I told her that wasn't true. I told her I had saved the house from foreclosure, that I had paid the mortgage every month for 3 years out of my own account while living somewhere else, that none of this had ever once been a secret from her, only a detail she'd never bothered to ask about because she'd never once thought she needed to check. "Get out," Linda said, quiet at first, testing the words. Then louder, her voice climbing into a register I didn't know she had, loud enough that the porch light across the street flicked on, loud enough that I could hear it ringing off the aluminum siding of the house next door. "Get out of my son's house." I stood there for one long second with my hand on the rail and my daughter pressing hard against my ribs, and I understood something with total clarity in that moment. The same clarity I get reading a loan file where all the numbers technically balance but something underneath them is still wrong. Linda was not confused. She knew exactly whose name was on that deed. She had just decided, standing in her doorway in her bathrobe, that the truth was less useful to her than the story, and that if she said it loud enough in front of enough witnesses, the story might overwrite the truth entirely. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I have spent my whole career learning that some people cannot be reasoned with in the moment they are performing for an audience, real or imagined, and that the only sane response is to stop performing back. I turned around, walked to my car with the laundry basket she'd already packed for me. She'd packed it before I even arrived. I realized later, the whole conversation staged around a decision she'd already made. And I drove to the Red Roof Inn off Route 60 with my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel at 10 and 2 like a new driver. I checked in under my own name. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial detergent, 8 months pregnant, and called Daniel, who picked up on the second ring, his voice already worried because it was 10 p.m. and I never called that late. I told him what happened. All of it in order, the way I'd tell a claims adjuster, because that's the only way I know how to speak when I'm too raw to editorialize. There was a long silence on his end, longer than I wanted, and for one terrible second I thought he was going to ask me to go back and smooth it over, the way I'd smoothed over every small thing for 3 years. Instead he said, "I'm driving back tonight." If you've ever had someone scream you out of a house you were the one holding up, and known in real time that arguing wasn't going to reach them, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them because that particular kind of quiet is a specific loneliness, and I don't think enough people talk about it. And if you're new here, stay with me because 3 days later, a letter arrived at that house that Linda never saw coming, and it's the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in a stiff hotel bed with my hands folded over the baby, running the conversation on a loop the way you'd review a denied application looking for the line where it went wrong, and I kept landing on the same detail. Linda hadn't been surprised. She'd had a lawyer's opinion in her back pocket, an opinion built on a story she'd apparently decided to believe rather than the facts sitting in a courthouse basement 40 minutes away. My father's voice came back to me somewhere around 2 a.m., the way it does when I'm too tired to keep it out. Paper remembers what people forget. I got up, turned on the lamp, and started making a list on hotel stationery because that is the only thing I know how to do with fear, not a revenge list, not yet. Just an inventory, every document, every account, every piece of paper that told the true story of that house and where each one was sitting. Daniel got to the hotel at 1:40 in the morning. still in the clothes he'd worn to his training in Columbus, and he sat down on the edge of that stiff hotel bed and put both hands over his face for a long moment before he said anything at all. "She called me on the drive," he said, "twice." I asked what she'd said. He was quiet, and I watched him decide in real time whether to soften it for me the way he'd been softening his mother for me our whole relationship. He didn't. "She said you tricked her out of Dad's house. She said you've been planning it since before we got married. She wants me to get a lawyer and have the deed transfer reversed." He looked at me, and something in his face had changed since the last time I'd seen it, 12 hours earlier, easy and unbothered over coffee before his training. "She's not going to let this go, Sarah. I need you to tell me everything, not the short version, everything." So I did. I told him about the refinance, the 90-day foreclosure window, the balloon payment his father had signed alone and never disclosed, the quitclaim deed his mother signed in his own lawyer's office with her own hand, dabbing her eyes and thanking God. I told him I'd photographed every page the night I signed, the way I photograph everything, and that the file still lived on a hard drive in a fireproof box in our closet, 3 years untouched, because neither he nor his mother had ever once asked to see it. I watched him do the math the way you watch someone realize, mid-sentence, that they've been repeating a story they never actually verified. His jaw worked. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which for Daniel, who fills silences the way other people fill grocery carts, was its own kind of confession. "I never asked you how it worked," he finally said. "I just knew you'd fixed it. I let that be enough." I didn't say anything back because there wasn't anything kind to say to that, and I didn't have the energy that night to be kind on his behalf as well as my own. We didn't go back to Cardinal Court. Daniel checked us into the room next to mine at the Red Roof Inn, and we stayed there for 2 nights while he called a real estate attorney the bank had used before, a woman named Carla Whitfield with an office above a dry cleaner in Marietta, because he wanted, he said, to understand exactly what his mother could and couldn't actually do. Carla's answer was almost identical to the one I already knew, the one I'd have given a client in my own office. The quitclaim deed was valid. Linda's signature, notarized, witnessed, executed with full legal counsel present at the time, was not something a lawyer could simply wave away 3 years later because she'd changed her mind about how it felt. A resulting trust claim, the argument that Linda had only signed because she believed I was holding the property for the family, was theoretically possible to file, Carla said, the same way it's theoretically possible to win the lottery. Long odds, expensive, and it would require Linda to prove intent that directly contradicted the plain language of a document she'd read and signed with a lawyer standing beside her. "The house is Sarah's," Carla said, looking at Daniel more than at me. "Whatever your mother's lawyer told her, he told her something he wanted her to hear, not something the county recorder's office agrees with." That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because Linda had never operated on what the county recorder's office agreed with. She operated on what a room believed, and she still had a room. 3 days after the porch, on a Friday afternoon, a letter went out from First Heritage Bank to the property address on Cardinal Court. It wasn't from me, and I want to be precise about that, because it matters for everything that happened after. It was a standard escrow analysis notice, the kind every mortgage servicer sends once a year, recalculating the monthly payment based on updated property tax and insurance figures. Routine, boring. The kind of letter that usually goes straight into a junk drawer. Except this one, like every piece of correspondence tied to that loan for 3 years, was addressed the way the county record required it to be addressed, to the borrower of record, Sarah Bennett. Care of the property at Cardinal Court, because that had always been the mailing address on file, since Linda herself had never once asked me to change it. Since Linda had never once, in 3 years, opened a except this time she read the name on the envelope before she opened it. Sarah Bennett. Borrower, not Linda Bennett, homeowner receiving a courtesy copy. Borrower on the loan, on the house she had just spent 3 days telling every member of her prayer group had been stolen from her family. I know exactly how it landed, because Daniel's sister Michelle called him that Friday evening, laughing in a way that had no humor in it at all, and put the story together for us secondhand. Linda had opened that letter standing at her own kitchen counter, the same counter where she'd once told Daniel she'd found extra money for the backsplash. And according to Michelle, She went completely silent for almost a full minute, staring at a piece of paper that said, in plain bank language, exactly what I had told her 3 days earlier on the porch, and exactly what she had chosen not to hear. The house had never been Daniel's to give her back. She called me 20 minutes later and I almost didn't pick up. I'm glad I did, because the woman on the other end of that call was not the woman who had screamed me off her porch. Her voice had a different pitch entirely, high and fast and edged with something that took me a second to name, because I had never once heard it directed at me before. Fear. Sarah, Linda's voice on the phone had gone thin, stripped of all its Sunday warmth and all its porch fury both. Sarah, there's been some kind of mistake. This letter says I don't understand what this letter says. Can you call the bank and get this straightened out? I stood in the hotel room with Daniel watching me from the bed, and I told her as plainly as I'd told her on the porch 3 days earlier that there was no mistake, that the loan had always been in my name, that the letter said exactly what I'd said to her, word for word, standing on her steps 8 months pregnant while she pointed me down the stairs. There was a long pause, and then Linda did something I should have expected and somehow still didn't. She pivoted. Well, of course it's your name, she said, brightening, the fear folding itself back into something more familiar. I just meant, Sarah, honey, I was upset the other night. I said things I didn't mean, you know how I get. Why don't you come by tomorrow, and we'll sort this whole thing out as a family? I want to be honest about what that call did to me, because it's the part of this story I understand least even now, months later. Some small, exhausted, pregnant part of me wanted to say yes. Wanted to drive back out to Cardinal Court and let her make me tea and pretend the porch had never happened. Because that had always been the shape of peace in that family. Not resolution, just a fast, warm forgetting. The same forgetting Linda had used on Jean's second refinance. On the balloon payment. On every hard thing that ever threatened to sit still long enough to be looked at. I told her I needed some time to think, and I hung up before she could answer. Daniel drove us to our own house that night instead of back to the hotel, and for the first time since October 14th, I slept somewhere that actually belonged to me. The next escalation didn't come from Linda directly. It came from Michelle 3 days later, forwarding a screenshot from the family group chat with a single line of her own attached. You should see this. Linda had posted something to the chat, 11 relatives, a couple of church friends who'd somehow ended up added years ago and never removed. That told a story I recognized the shape of immediately, because I underwrite stories like it for a living, the kind built entirely out of technically true details arranged to mean something false. She wrote that she'd recently learned some very concerning things about how the family home had been handled after Jean's passing. She wrote that she hoped everyone would keep her and Daniel in their prayers during this difficult time with Sarah. She never said the word deed. She never said refinance. She let the group fill in the blanks, the way she'd let me fill in the blanks on 100 small unkindnesses over 4 years. And I watched, over the next 48 hours, a chorus of hearts and praying hands emojis and one aunt writing family should never fight over a house, gather round her like a congregation gathering around its pastor. Nobody asked Linda a single follow-up question. Nobody asked what actually happened. That's the part that still sits wrong in my chest when I think about it, not that she lied exactly, but that lying wasn't even necessary. She just had to imply, warmly, in a room full of people who loved the story more than they loved the facts, and the facts simply lost by default. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop open, the fireproof box folder pulled up on screen, every page of the refinance, the recorded deed. I started drafting a message to that same group chat. It came out of me fluent, the way Stella Hayes once told me, no, that's not right, that's someone else's story. But I understand now exactly what she meant when she said the ledger doesn't care which side of it you're standing on. I wrote out the whole truth in 19 bullet points. Every date, every dollar, the balloon payment Jean never disclosed to his own wife. 3 years of mortgage payments I'd made while living somewhere else. Linda's signature on the quitclaim with her own lawyer standing beside her. I attached the county recorder's link. I could have sent it to 11 relatives and 2 church friends and let the same congregation that had gathered so warmly around Linda's version watch it collapse in real time under the weight of hers. I sat there with my cursor over the send button for a long time, one hand resting on the baby, who was doing her nightly gymnastics against my ribs, And I thought about what that message would actually buy me. Not the truth being known, the truth was already sitting in a courthouse basement 40 minutes from that house, indifferent and permanent, whether or not I ever spent a single word defending it. What that message would buy me was watching Linda lose face in front of everyone who loved her, on a stage I'd chosen, at a moment I'd picked for maximum damage. It would buy me exactly what she'd tried to buy on that porch. A story delivered loud enough to the right audience to make the truth irrelevant. I closed the laptop without sending it, not because I'd forgiven her. I hadn't, and I still haven't, not really. I closed it because somewhere underneath the anger, my father's voice was still sitting there patient as ever, telling me paper remembers what people forget, and I understood, finally, what that sentence had actually been teaching me all along. The paper doesn't need me to perform. It just needs to exist and to be true and to be ready the moment someone finally has to look at it honestly instead of conveniently. I deleted the draft. I went to bed. 2 days later, Linda's lawyer sent a formal letter to Carla Whitfield's office, requesting a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution regarding the Cardinal Court property, which was, translated out of lawyer, an admission that the resulting trust threat had quietly died the moment somebody on Linda's side actually read the file. Carla called me that afternoon and asked one question, the same question everyone in this story eventually gets asked once the shouting stops. What do you actually want out of this, Sarah? I told her I didn't want Linda in the street. I told her I didn't want to be the villain in this family's story just because I'd finally stopped agreeing to be its invisible foundation. What I wanted, I said, surprising myself a little with how clearly it came out once I finally said it plainly, was for exactly one thing to happen in a room with witnesses in it. I wanted Linda to hear the truth out loud from me, in front of the people who'd been praying over her version of events, and I wanted to be the one who decided what happened to that house next. Instead of Carla arranged the meeting for the following Sunday, at Cardinal Court, because Linda insisted it happen there, on her ground, in front of the same kitchen where she'd once told me she'd found extra money for the backsplash, and where, 3 weeks earlier, she'd read a bank letter that undid 4 years of a story she'd been telling herself. I was 38 weeks pregnant by then, 4 days from my due date, and I want to be honest with you, Daniel tried to talk me out of going. He offered to go without me, to let Carla handle it, to spare me the drive and the stairs and the stress a doctor would probably tell me to avoid. I told him no. I had spent 4 years being handled around, discussed instead of addressed, the invisible plumbing everyone assumed would keep working whether or not anyone looked at it. I was not going to let the one conversation that actually mattered happen without me in the room. Michelle was there when we arrived, which surprised me, and 2 of the aunts from the group chat, which surprised me less, because Linda never did anything without an audience if she could help it. She'd simply misjudged this time which way the audience was going to end up facing. Linda sat at the head of her own kitchen table in a blouse I recognized from church, hands folded, composed in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this, the same way she'd rehearsed the porch. I set my bag down on the counter, and inside it were 3 things the way I'd learned to carry things into rooms like this. The recorded deed, certified copy, county seal visible. 3 years of mortgage statements, bound with a binder clip. And the escrow letter itself, the one that had started all of it, folded back into its original envelope with her name, my name, printed clean on the front. Linda opened before I could. I want to say first, she said, looking around the table at her small assembled congregation, that I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, and I hope we can move past it as a family. I let her finish. I have learned, over 4 years and one very long October, that letting someone finish their performance is sometimes the only way to make the silence afterward land the way it needs to. There's no misunderstanding, Linda, I said, and I want you to know my voice did not shake, though my hands, resting flat on the table the way I'd trained myself to hold them steady under a doctor's blood pressure cuff, were doing something close to it underneath. You know exactly what happened to this house. You knew it the night you threw me off that porch, and you knew it faster than that when the bank letter arrived, because you called me within 20 minutes asking me to fix something you understood perfectly well. I was frightened, Linda said, quieter now, glancing at Michelle for support that didn't come. You were frightened of being caught telling a story that wasn't true, I said. That's different from being frightened of losing your home, Nobody was ever going to take this house from you, Linda. I refinanced your dead husband's balloon payment with my own credit because no bank in this state would touch your application. I paid this mortgage every month for 3 years while living somewhere else because you told me moving in felt disrespectful to Jean. And I believed you, the same way I believed you about the backsplash money, the same way I believed you for 4 years about almost everything, because you are very, very good at being believed. Nobody at that table said anything. One of the aunts had gone very still over her coffee cup. I opened the bag. I laid the deed down first, then the mortgage statements, then last, the escrow letter itself, and I slid all three across the table until they sat directly in front of Linda, the way you'd hand a claims file to the one person in the room who'd spent weeks arguing against its contents. You stood on that porch 8 months pregnant with your grandchild and screamed at me to get out of your son's house, I said. I want you to say it back to me now in front of your family with the deed in front of you. Whose house was it, Linda? She looked down at the papers. She looked up at Michelle, then at the aunts, and found nothing there to perform for, because for the first time in this entire story, the room was actually looking at the facts instead of at her. It was never his house, I said when she didn't answer, and I said it gently, the way you deliver a diagnosis you've been dreading having to give someone, because underneath everything I still didn't want to destroy her, and it was never yours to take back. It was mine. It's been mine since the week before my wedding, and every casserole and every cold comment and every, well, you tried, you ever handed me across this table I ate anyway because I thought that's what keeping a family together looked like. Linda's hands, folded so carefully when we walked in, had started to tremble against the papers. I'm not here to take anything else from you, I said. And this was the part I had decided, alone in a hotel room 4 weeks earlier, the part where the two roads finally split apart in front of me the way they'd been splitting apart all along. I could have walked into that kitchen and told her the house was going on the market within the month, that she had 90 days, the same 90 days Jean's balloon payment had once given her, and let her feel exactly what that clock sounds like ticking down. I thought about it, I won't pretend I didn't. Instead, I told her what Carla and I had drawn up that week. A lease, month to month, fair market rent adjusted down to reflect 4 years of her own contributions to the upkeep. Her name on it this time, actually on something, for the first time in this entire story, instead of assuming her way into ownership she'd never earned on paper. No more ambiguity, no more casual, unspoken arrangement resting entirely on my invisible goodwill. A real document with real terms that either of us could point to the next time the story tried to slip loose from the facts again. You can stay, I said, as a tenant, in writing, with a lease that says exactly what this is so nobody in this family ever has to guess again. Linda didn't cry the way I expected. She sat very still, looking at the deed with her name nowhere on it, and said the only true thing I ever heard her say in 4 years. I don't know how to be in this family, she said quietly, without being the one everyone owes something to. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't entirely. But I picked up my bag and Daniel walked around the table and put his hand on his mother's shoulder for just a second, not defending her, not this time, just present, and we left the papers on the table where she could read them as many times as she needed to. Alone, without an audience, the way the truth. We didn't hear from Linda for 6 days after that kitchen table. Michelle called Daniel the night we left not to relay a message from their mother, but because she needed, in her words, to say something out loud to someone before I lost my mind. She told him she'd known, or half known, for years, that their mother rewrote things when the truth got inconvenient, small things mostly, who'd said what at a funeral, whose idea of vacation had actually been, and that she'd never once seen it aimed at something with a county seal stamped on it. She said watching Linda go quiet at that table, actually quiet, no pivot ready, had been the strangest thing she'd witnessed her mother do in 30 years. The aunts, I'm told, left that Sunday afternoon and did not discuss it in the group chat. Nobody posted a praying hands emoji. Nobody asked Linda for an update. It turns out a story only travels as far as the room's willingness to keep repeating it, and once 3 witnesses had watched the deed hit the table, the story simply had nowhere left to go. Linda called me on the 6th day, a Saturday, and I almost didn't recognize her voice on the line, because it had none of the registers I'd cataloged over 4 years, not the church warmth, not the porch fury, not the thin fear from the night of the escrow letter. It was just tired. I read the lease, she said. I have some questions about the maintenance clause. That was the whole conversation. No apology, not really, nothing that would satisfy anyone watching this story hoping for a scene where she breaks down and says all the things a person is supposed to say. Just questions about a maintenance clause asked plainly, by a woman reading an actual document instead of managing a room. I answered every one of them the way I'd answer any tenant's question, professionally, patiently, and when we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time trying to figure out whether that counted as progress. I decided it did, not because it undid 4 years, but because it was the first time in 4 years Linda Bennett had ever asked me a direct question about paperwork instead of asking someone else to interpret me for her. Daniel struggled more than I expected him to in the days after. Not with defending his mother, that instinct, I think, actually broke something loose in him at that kitchen table, watching her hold papers she'd never once bothered to ask to see. He struggled instead with a quieter, harder thing, understanding how much he'd let me carry alone for so long simply by never asking how any of it worked. He said it to me one night, lying in the dark, in a voice I hadn't heard from him before, low and a little wrecked. I let you build the whole floor we were all standing on, he said, and I never once checked if it was strong enough because I trusted you'd tell me if it wasn't. That's not the same as helping you hold it up. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't entirely, and I've learned that the marriages that actually survive things like this are the ones where somebody's willing to say the true, uncomfortable sentence instead of the comfortable, kind one. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and that I needed him to actually mean it going forward, not just in the wreckage of a bad month, and he said he understood. And for the first time in 4 years, I believed he meant it in a way that would still be true in a year. The signed lease came back 9 days after the kitchen table, Linda's signature small and careful in the tenant line, a version of her handwriting I'd never seen before, not the confident loop she used on church bulletins, but something tighter, more deliberate, like a woman being careful with a document for the first time in her life. 4 days, our daughter was born at 11:52 that morning, 7 pounds even, with a full head of dark hair and a scream Daniel later described as your negotiation voice. We named her Grace. Not for any sentimental reason tied to this story, though people have asked, but because it was the name we'd picked out in June, long before any of this happened. Back when the worst thing I thought I had to worry about was whether Linda would approve of it. Linda came to the hospital on the second day, alone, no casserole, no audience. She stood in the doorway of my room the way she'd once stood in the doorway of her own house, except this time she didn't cross her arms and she didn't raise her voice. She asked quietly if she could come in. I let her. I want to be honest about why, not because 4 years and one porch scream had been erased by a baby, and not because I'm the kind of person who pretends forgiveness arrives on a schedule that's convenient for everyone else. I let her in because Grace was going to be her granddaughter whether either of us liked the shape of that relationship or not. And I had decided, alone in that hospital bed, that I would rather build something honest and limited than something warm and false. Linda held Grace for 11 minutes. I counted, the way I count things. She didn't say much. At one point she looked up at me and said, "She has Jean's chin," which was true, and which was the first time in 4 years Linda Bennett had ever said something to me that wasn't managing an outcome. Here is where things actually stand now, 6 months out, because I promised you facts and not a fairy tale. Linda still lives at Cardinal Court, on the lease, paying rent on time on the first of every month, into an account I check the same way I check any file. Not because I don't trust her exactly, but because paper is how I make peace with uncertain people, and I've stopped apologizing for that. The maintenance clause has come up twice, both times handled by email, both times resolved without either of us raising our voice. It is not warm. It is not what either of us pictured when Daniel proposed under that maple tree. It is, however, true, and I have come to believe that true is worth more than warm, especially with people who have shown you they'll trade the truth for a better story the moment it's convenient. Daniel and Linda talk more than Linda and I do, which is right and which I've made my peace with. He goes to Cardinal Court most Sundays, sometimes with Grace, sometimes alone. He tells me what's said. I don't ask him to filter it for me anymore, and he doesn't offer to. It's a smaller relationship between mother and son than the one that existed before October, and I think, though neither of them has said it to me directly, that it might actually be a more honest one. The group chat still exists. Nobody's ever mentioned the deed in it again. Michelle and I talk now in a way we never used to, mostly about Grace, sometimes about her own mother in the careful, sideways way you talk about someone you love and no longer fully trust. Linda sent one letter in March, handwritten. No explanation for why she chose paper over a phone call, though I think now that she understood something about paper that she hadn't before. It didn't apologize outright. I don't think Linda Bennett has that sentence in her, not fully, not yet, but it thanked me for the lease for the maintenance clause. For what she called, finally telling me the truth even when I made it hard to hear. I put it in the fireproof box, in the same folder as the deed and the mortgage statements and the escrow letter that started all of it. Because that's where I keep the things that matter enough to survive me forgetting the details. And because some part of me still believes, the way my father believed, that paper remembers what people forget, even the good parts. Even the parts that took. I think about that October night more than I'd like to, especially now, watching Grace learn to stand by pulling herself up on the coffee table in the living room of the house I bought with my own name on it. No quitclaim, no ambiguity, nobody's story but mine to tell. Here's what I know now that I didn't know standing on Linda's porch with a laundry basket in my arms. Being needed by a family and being seen by one are not the same thing, and you can spend years mistaking the first for the second if nobody ever asks you to prove the difference. I carried that house for 4 years, quietly, invisibly, the way I'd been taught was the loving thing to do, and it took one bank letter mailed on a routine Tuesday for reasons that had nothing to do with me to finally make the truth impossible to ignore. I don't regret refinancing that loan. I don't regret saving that house. What I regret, if I'm honest, is how long I let the story about who I was in that family stay unwritten, undocumented, resting entirely on everyone else's goodwill, instead of on something I could actually point to when the goodwill ran out. My father spent 30 years reading deeds for strangers so they'd never have to find out the hard way whose name was really on their own front door. I spent 4 years forgetting to apply that lesson to my own life, until a woman in a bathrobe screamed me down her porch steps and accidentally taught me what I should have known all along. Paper remembers what people forget. But you have to be the one willing to write it down in the first place, and you have to be willing, when the moment finally comes, to put it on the table and let it speak for you. That's my story. One quitclaim deed, one bank letter, and one porch scream that turned out to be true in a way Linda never intended. If someone in your life has ever let you carry the weight of something and then tried to tell everyone else you never held it at all, take this as your sign, write it down. Keep the receipts. Not because you're planning a war, but because someday the truth is going to need somewhere to stand, and you deserve to be the one holding it. Share this with someone who's been quietly holding up a family that never once said thank you. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done on that porch. And hit subscribe because there's always another story.